Hi everyone. As you continue reading into the book by Ramsey, he's going to start talking about different areas of Christian ethics that, in terms of and unpacking one of the aspects of Christian ethics. And one of the first topics he's going to get into is this idea of Christian love. One of the things that people oftentimes talk about is that this ethic of love that goes into Christian ethics, Christian thought, how God is love, how love is described in sacred literature like the Bible. But the problem is that love is one of those terms that is so ambiguous and has opened itself up to so many different meanings that, when a word can mean almost anything someone wants it to mean when they say it, the word itself becomes, if it can mean too many things, it becomes meaningless because it doesn't have a meaning. Therefore, it's important to kind of consider what we mean when we talk about Christian love, and especially if you're going to compare conversations about Christian love to sacred literature from which this is supposedly derived. Now, in the New Testament, there's three Greek words that are dominantly used for these for love in the New Testament. Those words are agape, phileo, and eros. And in reverse order, eros is typically the romantic love. It's where we get the term erotic, but it doesn't merely have to do with eroticism. It has to do with the romantic love that happens between people, and that's celebrated. It's celebrated in the Song of Songs in the Old Testament. It's celebrated even in the New Testament, but sometimes it's given even a negative connotation, like to avoid the unproductive or self-destructive desires or vices. But eros has to do with their romantic love. The other term, phileos or phileo, has to do with brotherly love. We get our term Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, from that. And that has to do with, phileo has to do with that platonic love that happens between comrades or between friends. It can be platonic relationships between the sexes. It can be just brotherly or especially comradeship type of love, special friendships that this describes. And then the term that's oftentimes invoked most to describe, say, God's love is the term agape. And agape has to do with a selfless love, or a love that doesn't require return. It's not an exchange system. Oftentimes the analogy is used of the love that's given from a parent to a child. If someone who has small children, they realize that the child can't really do anything for you, they can't give anything back to you, and especially when the child is young, that agape, that parental love is directed toward the child, and it is one directional. It doesn't require anything in return for its expression. So those are the three dominant terms. Now in English, though, we don't restrict it to just those three categories. We say we love our car, we love our cat, we love ice cream, and we love our significant other. So it has such an elastic, wide range of meaning that, and unfortunately, as used in English, we tend to invoke all those different types of meanings when we say we love something. So, for example, if you're going to apply that to, say, Christian ethics, or if you're going to apply that to, say, even ethical or even moral issues of the day, it begs the question of what do you mean when you say love? When someone loves another, how does that shown, or what do they mean? Do you always love someone and love everything and want everything good for them? Or do you love them as an exchange system, what they can give for you? Sometimes does that love have to do with warnings of don't do this, you might hurt yourself, and someone will respond, well, I thought you loved me. Don't you want to just let me do what I want? And of course, even now, even the parent says to the teen or someone, no, I do love you, therefore I warn you not to engage in something self-destructive. So love has a very elastic meaning, and so you have to be more specific what you mean when you say, what does it mean when you define love? And when you invoke the term Christian love, specifically in Ramsey's book, and you start writing on that later on in an essay exam, or even in a final paper, when you write on the idea of Christian love, you have to define that term. You can't just throw it out willy-nilly. You can't just invoke it and assume that the reader knows what you mean when you say it, because they probably don't. With that level of elastic meaning, you have to define this term. You have to give it some parameters. You have to give it some boundaries. Here's what I mean when I say love, and here's what I don't mean when I say I love. The meaning I use for love, whether it's Christian love directed at another, has to do with it has to do with something within these parameters of definition, and things that fall outside of it is not what I mean. So you have to be more specific about that. This is one of the great dangers people have when they say look into sacred literature like the New Testament, or they look into writings about Christian ethics like in Ramsey, is the term Christian love is thrown out and you don't know what it is that you mean when you say. For example, people say, okay, love one another. Fine. Okay, so you love one another. What does that mean? What does that look like? So you go down the street, say downtown Houston, and downtown Houston has a considerable homeless problem. It still has. It has for a long time. So many will say, okay, if you are loving toward the homeless when they come up to alongside your car and you're stopped at a stoplight, and you give them something for them to use for food. You give them some money. You roll down your window and you give them. That's loving. Others will vehemently disagree with you. They'll say, no. Part of the challenges and part of the problems oftentimes that result in homelessness is a chronic instinct toward making decisions that are self-destructive. And so therefore they say if you are loving toward the homeless, don't give money directly. Give it to a shelter. Donate to things where people are street savvy. They can read through the problems and they can minister to these people according to the needs they actually have, rather than just the immediate demand for money. So what's the loving thing to do? Is it if you have an affection for the homeless in Houston and you're trying to demonstrate Christian love, what's the loving act? Is it to give money directly when you stop at a light on Louisiana Street? Or potentially empowering or enabling a destructive habit that's keeping them homeless? Or is it the loving act to volunteer in a homeless shelter or give to a homeless shelter people who are adept and skilled at reading the signs of what it, and knowing they're street savvy, they know they can interact with people and know what the actual needs are. So there's debate about exactly what it is you're going to do when you say I'm going to act loving or I'm going to demonstrate Christian love. Now, obviously a person doesn't have to be a Christian in order to demonstrate this, but in the class on Christianity and ethics, we're discussing what is the biblical teaching on love, the attitudes and actions toward others, even toward yourself, and how is that manifested? Well, you're going to have to define what you mean when you use that four-letter word, love, because it's not very easy to nail down. In fact, most often you have to use the fullness of the New Testament writing in order to arrive at some sort of definition, some sort of boundaries, what you mean when you say loving. Sometimes loving is showing acceptance toward one person and loving is showing disciplinary language toward another. Sometimes loving is being generous to one and not enabling vice for another. Sometimes love is accepting, and sometimes love takes a form of some sort of rejection. The whole of sacred literature deals with this, and if you're going to adopt words out of the sacred literature, you therefore have to let that literature define what those terms mean when you use them. So as you read in through the Ramsey book, and he starts going into the ethics of Christian love and how it's demonstrated for others throughout various different ethical and moral questions that arise, you have to remember that the term love, in terms of Christian love, that term is not easy to define. You have to do some considerable work to define it, and oftentimes even go outside of Ramsey in order to see other areas that define what that might mean, because language means things. Words mean things, and you can't just simply make them up or make up your own definition for them and expect your readers to know what you mean when you say it. All right? Keep that in mind as you read through Ramsey.